Last class we talked about how each of the colonies was established and created, and we went from north to south. Today we're going to talk about the commerce and the resulting culture that is created in each of those areas. And we're going to start from the south and go north. Now, one thing that is common throughout the colonies, and you could say to some extent throughout Europe, is in the 18th century, there is a slight move away from subsistence farming. And what I mean by that is farmers who their entire occupation is farming in order simply to live, producing just enough to feed yourself and your family and maybe have a little extra to sell. As international trade grows, as other industries grow, this won't be the primary way that the world lives. We start to see this change in the Caribbean. This was one of the first areas that really was completely renovated, deforested for the purpose of wide-scale planting. Parts of these islands would be created into plantations and owned by English noblemen, wealthy English people, but they would not be in the Caribbean. They'd be absentee. They would have other people work on the land and send the money to England. There's going to be tobacco, there's going to be sugar and cotton, and this is as far back as the 1630s. Pretty soon after that, it becomes evident that this is really hard labor, so it'd be nice to have a new labor force. And so that's going to be the slaves who are brought over largely by Dutch traders. And in the Caribbean, sugar is going to be the main crop within just a few years. Then moving a little bit north, we're going to go to what we will call the southern colonies. This will be Georgia, the Carolinas, and to some extent, Virginia. Their specialty is cash crops. We already talked last class about tobacco. That was John Rolfe bringing that. And cash crops, think of this like Costco. If you buy in bulk or you farm in bulk, you're going to save in the long run. You already have the systems in place. You already have the workers, so just make them work a bit more. Tobacco, indigo, which is a dye for fabric. In this case, it will be for cotton. And then we have rice. All of these are going to be cash crops, large-scale plantation crops. In the English colonies, it first is going to be harvested by indentured servants. These are people coming from Europe. They want to come to the New World, but they can't afford it. So as a way to earn their way across the Atlantic, they will sign up to work for 7 years for one of these landowners. They will work for 7 years for free, and then they will be allowed to leave. But at that point, they have not made any money. They cannot support themselves. They can't afford a house, so they become tenant farmers for the rest of their lives. Then we have some things that change in the 1660s. One of those things is that the Dutch sort of improve the mechanics of the slave trade, so there are more slaves available. Also, there are new laws. In Virginia, there's a law that says if a child is born to an enslaved woman, that child is a slave. That slavery is an inherited condition. So for slaves, that's a self-propagating people group. And so plantation owners start to think maybe slaves would be a better investment. But slaves are very expensive to buy. But when you look at the facts, it does make more sense economically. For an indentured servant, they are bound to you for 7 years. A slave is bound to you for life. For an indentured servant, they're probably an English citizen, so you're going to have to use English laws with them and respect their rights as an English citizen. Not the case with slaves from Africa. They are not citizens of any country, so you don't have to respect that at all. Also, most of these indentured servants are Christians and will want to observe and have the day off for Christian holidays. These slaves coming from Africa are not Christians, so that doesn't have to be recognized at all. Some of the slaves who come to the New World are going to be exposed to the Christian faith, and what would happen with most slaves before they made it to the colonies, the American colonies, they would sort of have a stopover in the Caribbean, which would be called seasoning, where they would be trained and prepared so that they're not the newbies by the time they get to the American colonies. There are lots of different cultures, lots of different tribes that are thrown together in these slave communities, and they start forging their own distinct slave culture. And for those that had faith, that had been exposed to Christianity, they do pull that into this new slave culture that combines many different backgrounds. And even today in America, we still see the influence of that in African American culture, that it's very tied to the slave experience. This exposure of education and faith for the slaves, though, does backfire in 1739 with the Stono Rebellion. This takes place in South Carolina, and there had been some tension between England and Spain. So the English leaders and the governments weren't really paying close attention to what was going on in the colonies, and these plantation owners were they were distracted. So in that sense, it was the perfect opportunity for a slave rebellion. There are some slaves that came from the Congo, and when they were in the Caribbean, they had been exposed to Catholic teachings and had converted. So we're seeing a link between faith and education, like we saw in New England, but now in the South with the slaves. Ultimately, they get the support of dozens of slaves, almost 100 slaves, and they attack several plantations, probably 6 or 7 plantations, kill about 30 white people. It takes a while for these rebels to be found. They are, of course, executed or sold off to plantations in the West Indies, in the Caribbean. What really is most important about this rebellion is the result. Plenty of laws are passed. One says that there must be a ratio of 10 slaves to 1 white foreman to make sure that there is always a strong white presence amongst the slaves. There also is a law that forbids slaves to be taught to read. It does not allow them to assemble in groups because they might be plotting something. They can't earn their own money. They can't make their own food because we want to limit these assemblies of slaves as much as possible to not allow them to plot against the whites. It also reduces the opportunities to free slaves, but it does create penalties for masters who are too harsh. So it's trying to establish a system that is entirely economically beneficial. In the economic sense, if a master is too harsh, they are going to run down their slaves, and their slaves won't be as productive. This isn't being done for human rights issues. So we are seeing as early as the 1700s, early 1700s, a very clear plantation slave owning culture emerging in the southern colonies. In the middle colonies, this would be Pennsylvania, Delaware, New Jersey, and New York. They have a combination of trade. You can see all these ships here in a harbor, things ready to be bought and sold, but also combined with farming, with agricultural products. There is tobacco in Maryland. Wheat is a major product, lumber as well. And so there's a combination of the rural and the urban. And that's one thing that's very different about the middle colonies compared to the southern, is there are cities like Philadelphia, like New York. And the cities are a beacon. They're a really attractive prospect for free blacks. Blacks who have been freed, or they have earned or bought or whatever with their freedom, they're not going to want to stay in the South where there is a culture of enslaving black people. So the more northern or the central cities are a place where they can be free, but they can also create a life for themselves. There are a wider variety of jobs, not just agricultural jobs in these cities. It'll also be a place for people maybe like single women, widows, who don't necessarily have the ability to run a farm by themselves. They now have a place where they can live, or jobs that they might be able to do in a more urban setting. Then continuing further north, we have New England, and this of course is going to be Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts. Boston is going to be the main city in New England, and their big economic moneymaker is trade, specifically shipping. There's not nearly as much territory. There is farming that takes place, but there's not as much territory that can be used as arable land, and shipping is going to be a major trade in the north. Because there's not as many agricultural jobs, there's going to be new needs in the job market, which is going to require educated people. And so we see the establishment of the first universities in the colonies in New England. And this is going to be Harvard and Yale. And this is just going to add to the growing obvious differences between North and South. We're already seeing cultural differences, we're already seeing economic differences. And what I'm trying to hint to you is that the issues of the Civil War were established decades, if not centuries, before that conflict began. Back to the universities. Both Harvard and Yale were established as centers of education for ministers. You can see for Harvard's crest, they say Veritas, truth. In the 1600s, when Harvard was established, that truth comes from the Bible. And in the North, you have more of an emphasis on education and those congregational societies, linking together the civic world with the religious world. With Yale, which was established in 1701, their motto is Lux et Veritas, truth and light, again, religious. Also, you see that book has Hebrew on it. All freshmen at Yale were required to take a Hebrew class for a year because they believed you could only be an effective minister if you read the Bible in its original text, in the Hebrew. So we're seeing these two universities, which still exist today and certainly are not Christian institutions, their basis is in faith. The basis of this country is in people of Christian faith. We also see in these colonies the importance of social mobility. That unlike in Europe in the 1700s, in the New World, in the colonies, there is the possibility to work hard, to get an education, to get some luck, and to get a good job, and to change your social status. There's also far more land in the New World than there is in Europe, and this is going to possibly change your social status and your economic status. The last place we're going to talk about doesn't entirely fit into one of the three categories of colonies. It's the backcountry, or the boonies. And immigrants had been coming to this land for 100 years, but they have settled right along the coast. By the mid-1700s, the immigrants who are coming to these colonies, if they are not wealthy, they're not going to be able to afford to live on the coast, because the wealthy English settlers are going to buy all of the desirable land on the coast, because that's going to be most effective for trade. So we start to see in the mid-1700s groups of immigrants coming from especially Scotland and Ireland. And in class I played some clips of music for you where in the Appalachian Mountains there is still to this day the influence of the Scots-Irish. And I'll try and post those clips on Canvas for you. Again, you can see the similarities between American music and Scottish music. one problem that these settlers in the backcountry experienced is because they are further from these population centers, it means they are closer to the Indians. And there were some examples when the settlers felt that they were not being protected by the government. And in 1771, there is a small little scuffle called the War of Regulation, these people called the Regulators, and they were sort of protesting against the local government, saying, we want more protection, we want you to be more involved. Some people say that this was the prequel to the American Revolution. Yes, it is, in that these people were protesting, but what the Regulators were saying was they want to be part of England, they want to be part of the English Empire, but they want the government to be the government. And interestingly, many of the people who were part of this War of Regulation in 1770 stayed as loyalists. They sided with England when it came to the Revolutionary War. So now we're starting to see that there are distinct cultures in these different regions, and there are some things that will start playing into why these colonies will want to break away from their mother country.